There is a particular kind of silence that follows the moment a man realizes his entire world is built on nothing. Not the silence of an empty room, or the silence of a sleepless night, but the silence that settles in the chest like concrete, the kind that a person carries for years without knowing what to call it. Gerald Hutchins stood in a hotel corridor in Manila on a Thursday afternoon in November, his hand raised to knock on a door, when that silence found him for the very first time. He had flown 9,000 miles to surprise the woman he called his wife. He had crossed date lines and time zones, rehearsed what he would say when she opened the door, and found him standing there, his wide, warm smile, the bouquet of Sampaguita flowers he'd bought from a vendor outside the terminal, the bottle of wine tucked under his arm. He had imagined her face 100 times on the plane. The shock, then the joy, then the way she would fold herself into him and whisper something in Tagalog that he wouldn't understand but wouldn't need to. What Gerald Hutchins heard through that door instead was not her voice calling his name. This is the story of a man who gave everything he had to a love that was never real, and the 11 seconds in a Manila hotel corridor that finally forced him to see the truth. Gerald Hutchins had spent 31 years doing work that most people didn't think about until something went wrong. Pipeline engineering was like that, invisible when it functioned, catastrophic when it didn't. He'd worked oil fields in Texas and Oklahoma, overseen infrastructure projects in Wyoming and North Dakota, spent entire winters in places where the wind came at a man sideways, and the nearest town was 40 minutes of bad road away. It was solitary work by nature. And Gary, as everyone who knew him called him, had grown accustomed to his own company in ways that didn't fully reveal themselves until he was back home in Tulsa and realized he preferred the silence of the job site to the silence of his own house. He retired at 59. His pension was solid, the product of 3 decades of careful work, and his savings sat at around $340,000, the accumulated result of a life lived mostly without extravagance. He owned his house outright. He had no debt. On paper, Gerald Hutchins was a man who had arrived exactly where he set out to go. The reality was more complicated. His marriage to Deborah had ended 7 years earlier, not with a dramatic rupture, but with a slow, grinding erosion that neither of them had the energy to stop. The divorce was technically mutual. But the truth, Gary spent several years drinking his way around before finding a therapist who helped him sit with it, was that Deborah had left him for a man she worked with at the hospital where she was a billing administrator. Gary had found out through a mutual friend at a 4th of July barbecue, the kind of discovery that strips a moment of all its color and leaves a man standing in the middle of a yard holding a beer he no longer wants, nodding at someone who is still talking, while a quiet devastation rearranges everything inside him. He never fully recovered from the particular wound of that. Not the infidelity itself, though that hurt in ways he couldn't always articulate, but the underlying message it carried, that he had not been enough, that someone who had looked at him every morning for 24 years had eventually looked elsewhere and found something better. That wound had a way of reopening without warning. Retirement made it worse. When he was working, the days had structure and purpose. He was needed, consulted, respected. Engineers under him asked for his opinion. Clients called his cell phone directly. Now the days opened in front of him like long, featureless planes, and there was no one calling his phone at all. He took up woodworking for 6 months. He bought a boat he used twice. He volunteered at a food bank on Saturday mornings, which helped somewhat. He had 2 close friends in Tulsa, his neighbor Dennis and his former colleague Ray, both of whom were still married and embedded in the rhythms of family life in ways that made Gary feel like an outsider looking through glass, at a warmth he no longer had access to. It was Dennis who first mentioned the Filipino dating apps. Not as a recommendation, exactly more as something he'd read about online, the way people pass along information without being entirely sure why. Gary had laughed it off. He was 60 years old. He was not the kind of man who did things like that. 3 weeks later, at 11:30 on a Tuesday night when the house felt particularly large and the television had been on for 4 hours without him watching it, he downloaded an app called Filipino Cupid and told himself he was just curious. He created a profile with one photo, a decent one, taken at Ray's backyard party the previous summer, and a brief description that understated his financial situation and tried to convey, with moderate success, that he was a straightforward man looking for genuine connection. Within 48 hours, he had more messages than he knew what to do with. Most he scrolled past. Some he replied to briefly before the conversation died naturally. And then, on a quiet Sunday morning in February, he received a message from a woman named Marisel de los Santos Aguilar. Her profile photo showed a petite woman in her late 20s, dark hair pulled back, sitting at what appeared to be a restaurant table with a glass of juice in front of her. She was smiling, not the posed, performative smile of someone who knew they were being photographed for effect, but the kind of smile that reached the eyes, the kind that suggested she had just heard something that genuinely amused her. Her profile said she was 29, worked as an export coordinator for a garments company based in Cebu, and described herself as family-oriented, devout, and hoping to find something real. Her opening message was simple. "Good morning. I hope this isn't too forward. I just liked your profile. You seem like a genuine person." Gary stared at his phone for a long moment. Then he typed back, "Good morning to you too. Not forward at all. If you've been enjoying the stories I tell, please consider hitting the subscribe button. Your support is crucial for the growth of this channel and helps me dedicate time to making these videos despite my commitment to a full-time job. Thank you for being here." What followed was something Gary later struggled to describe without sounding naive, though the therapist he eventually saw would remind him, more than once, that the word naive implies a failure of intelligence, and intelligence had very little to do with what happened to him. Marisel wrote the way careful people write when they want to be understood. Her messages were thoughtful and specific. She asked about his work, not in the generic way of someone filling silence, but with follow-up questions that suggested she had actually processed what he said. When he told her about the pipeline projects in North Dakota, she asked what it felt like to build something that people depended on but never saw. The question surprised him. He hadn't thought about it in those terms before. He wrote back a longer answer than he intended to. She told him about herself in pieces, the way people do when they're accustomed to not being asked. She had grown up in a small barangay in Leyte, a province on one of the central islands of the Philippines, in a household held together by her mother's stubbornness and very little else. Her father had died when she was 12. She had put herself through a 2-year business course in Cebu City and worked her way into a position at the garments company through a combination of diligence and what she called, without apparent self-pity, not having any other option. She attended Mass on Sundays. She sent money home to her mother every month. She had a younger sister who was still in school. Gary found all of this deeply credible, which of course was entirely by design. The video calls began in the 3rd week. Marisel would appear on his screen in the early evening Philippine time, which was Gary's morning in Tulsa. She would be freshly dressed, often with a small wooden cross visible on the wall behind her. The sounds of Cebu City drifting in through what she said was an open window. She would say good morning to him in a way that made it sound like his presence at the start of her day was something she had been waiting for. She called him mahal, a Tagalog word she translated for him as something between dear and my love, with the kind of ease that made it feel less like a term of endearment and more like an established fact. Gary was not a man who had been called mahal before. He was not a man who had been called much of anything by a woman in quite some time. The effect of it was more powerful than he would have predicted. He told himself, during this period, that he was being careful. He reminded himself of everything he'd read about online scams. He was watching for the signs, the request for money early on, the vague and unverifiable backstory, the too perfect profession of love delivered too soon. None of those things appeared. Marisel was patient in a way that didn't feel strategic. She laughed at his jokes with what seemed like genuine amusement. She disagreed with him sometimes once, quite directly, when he made an offhand comment about a political situation in Southeast Asia that she corrected with a quiet but firm precision that impressed him. When a scammer tells you they love you in the 2nd week, a careful man walks away. When a woman takes 3 months to hold your gaze through a screen and say nothing more than that, she looks forward to talking to you, a careful man begins to trust her. By April, they were talking every day. By May, the calls had lengthened from 30 minutes to 2 and 3 hours. Gary rearranged his mornings around her. He would wake earlier than he needed to, make coffee, sit at the kitchen table, and wait for her face to appear on his laptop screen the way a man waits for the one part of the day that makes the rest of it make sense. It was in May that Marisel first mentioned her mother. She brought it up almost incidentally, the way people mention things they've been carrying for a while but haven't wanted to burden anyone with. Her mother had been unwell for some time, a problem with her heart, the doctors said, something that required medication she couldn't always afford. The Barangay Health Center could only do so much. The previous week, her mother had spent 2 nights in discomfort because they had run short on a prescription. Gary asked how much the medication cost. Marisel said she didn't want to talk about money. She said she was handling it. Gary pressed gently, the way a person presses when they sense that someone is refusing help out of pride rather than indifference. Marisel gave him a number the equivalent of $1,800 for a 3-month supply of what she described as a blood pressure and heart stabilization regimen. Gary sent the money the following morning. He used Western Union, and he did not think about it for very long, which is not the same thing as not thinking about it at all. He thought about it briefly, and then decided that if this was a test of his character, he intended to pass it. Marisel's response was not what a scammer script would typically produce. She did not express overwhelming gratitude. She expressed something closer to discomfort. She thanked him, and then said she hoped this didn't change the nature of what they were building, that she didn't want him to think of her as someone who needed saving. She said it mattered to her that he saw her as a partner, not a project. The distinction she drew made Gary trust her more. That was the point. He flew to Cebu in July. He had gone back and forth about it for weeks. Was it too soon? Was it too far? Was this the kind of thing a reasonable 61-year-old man did? And in the end, he had called Ray and described the situation, and Ray had said, "Gary, if you're this far gone already, you might as well go find out if she's real." It was blunt advice, but it was honest, and Gary respected honest. He booked a direct flight from Tulsa to Los Angeles and connected through Seoul into Mactangent Cebu International Airport, arriving on a Tuesday morning in late July when the air outside the terminal hit him like a warm, wet curtain and the chaos of the arrival zone. The taxis, the relatives, the jeepney drivers calling out destinations. The particular noise of a Philippine city in full morning swing immediately overwhelmed his senses in a way he hadn't expected and somehow found exhilarating. Marisel was waiting for him near the exit, wearing a white blouse and carrying a small sign with his name written in careful block letters, which was unnecessary given that they had seen each other's faces for months, but which she had brought anyway. She explained later, because she wanted the moment to feel right. She was smaller in person than he had imagined, not in any disappointing way, simply in the way that people are always slightly different from their screen versions, as if the camera adds a dimension that the body then subtracts. She reached up to hug him and said quietly, "You actually came." And there was something in the way she said it, the faint disbelief, as if she had been half expecting him not to, that moved him in a way he wouldn't fully understand until much later. The week that followed was structured with the expertise of someone who understood exactly what it needed to accomplish. Marisel had arranged for him to stay at a mid-range hotel in the Cebu IT Park District, comfortable, clean, close to restaurants and cafes where they would spend long afternoons talking. She took time off work, she said, to be with him fully during his visit. She showed him the city methodically and lovingly, the Basilica Minore del Santo Niño at dawn when the incense and the quiet made it feel genuinely sacred, the carbon market in the early morning chaos of its most authentic hour. A beach on Mactan Island on the third day, where she sat beside him in the late afternoon light and said very little, which he later remembered as one of the most companionable silences he had ever shared with anyone. She introduced him to her friends, a colleague from the garments company, a woman from her church named Rosario, a cousin who worked at a call center and spoke excellent English, and asked Gary thoughtful questions about Oklahoma that suggested she had actually looked it up in advance. Everyone was warm. Everyone made him feel welcome. On the 5th day, she took him to her apartment, a modest 2-room space in a building near the University District, with a small balcony overlooking a narrow street, and the sounds of the neighborhood rising through the afternoon heat. There were family photographs on the wall, a small religious shrine near the door, a stack of books on the kitchen table, with a Tagalog Bible on top. Gary stood in the doorway and felt with some certainty that he was standing inside a real person's life. They had dinner that night at a restaurant near the waterfront. Simple food, Cebu lechon and rice and San Miguel beers, and somewhere between the second and third beer, Gary said something he hadn't planned to say. He said that he hadn't felt like himself in years, not the version of himself he actually liked, and that talking to her had started to change that, and that being here with her had made it concrete in a way he wasn't sure he knew what to do with. Marisel looked at him across the table for a long moment and said, "Then don't do anything with it yet. Just let it be true." He proposed 3 days later. He had not brought a ring. There was nothing to bring. He hadn't planned this, but he asked her in a small garden near the hotel while a cat slept on the wall behind them. And she said yes, and she cried. And he cried a little too, which was not something Gary Hutchins did in front of people as a general rule. The moment was photographed by a passing stranger whom Marisel had quietly asked to stand by with her phone. Gary would look at that photo for a long time in the months that followed, searching for something in his own expression that might have warned him. He never found it. He only found a man who looked, for the first time in years, genuinely happy. He flew home to Tulsa with a plan, and the first real sense of forward motion he'd experienced since retirement. They would continue as they had been daily calls, daily messages, while the visa and legal paperwork for Marisel's eventual move to the United States were sorted out. She had explained to him, with apologetic patience, that the process was lengthy and bureaucratically complicated. The K-1 fiancé visa alone could take 8 to 12 months, and that was before any petition processing delays. She would stay in Cebu, continue her work, and they would maintain what they had built until the path to being together permanently was clear. Gary told his neighbor Dennis over a beer in Dennis's backyard the week after he returned. Dennis listened carefully and said the things a good friend says. He asked questions. He didn't immediately produce objections. He gave Gary room to tell the story in his own way. When Gary finished, Dennis was quiet for a moment and then said, "I want you to be happy, man. I just want you to make sure you're not running towards something because you're running away from something else." It was a fair thing to say. Gary didn't have a clean answer for it. He began sending a monthly allowance in August, $600, which felt to him like a reasonable contribution to their shared future. Marisel protested the first time, saying she could manage on her own salary, and Gary told her it wasn't charity, it was partnership, and that he'd feel better knowing she wasn't counting every peso between now and when they could be together in the same country. She accepted after the second conversation about it and sent him a photo of herself at the market, a basket of vegetables in her hand, with a caption that read, "Bought groceries with your contribution to our future. Thank you, Mahal." He had it printed and put it in a frame on his kitchen shelf. The months settled into a pattern. Morning calls before her workday started. Evening messages when she had time. Occasional weekends of longer video sessions when neither of them had anywhere to be. She remembered things he told her, offhand details about his friends. Something his daughter had said during a phone call. The name of his dog who had died 3 years before retirement. She asked about these things in follow-up conversations, as if she had been carrying them with her, which she had just not for the reasons he believed. In October, she told him she thought they should consider getting married in the Philippines before the U.S. visa process was fully complete. A civil ceremony. She said nothing elaborate. Just something that made them official, gave them a legal foundation to stand on. She had spoken to a friend who worked at the local civil registry, and the documentation process was straightforward. She seemed almost embarrassed to suggest it, as if she worried he would think she was pushing. Gary thought about it for 3 days. Then he booked a return flight to Cebu. The ceremony was held on a Saturday morning in a small room at the civil registry office in Cebu City, with Marisel's cousin and a colleague from her office serving as witnesses. Marisel wore a cream-colored dress she said her mother had helped her choose. Gary wore the one decent blazer he had packed and felt, throughout the brief proceedings, the particular surreal quality of a moment that is simultaneously completely ordinary and completely extraordinary. Afterward, they had lunch at a restaurant in the Ayala Center Mall, a proper celebratory meal, wine and seafood, and a small cake the restaurant brought out unexpectedly. And Gary thought, This is my life now. This is what comes next. He flew home 4 days later. Marisel stayed in Cebu to, as she put it, begin coordinating the paperwork from her end. If Gary's friends in Tulsa had reservations about the marriage, and Dennis and Ray both did, though they expressed them carefully and only once each, understanding that a man in Gary's position wasn't going to be talked out of anything by people who hadn't been there, they kept those reservations mostly to themselves after a certain point. The wedding had happened. The thing was done. All they could do now was hope that Gary was right about what he had found. What they could not know, what Gary could not know, was what Marisel's life in Cebu actually looked like when his video calls had ended. The apartment near the university district was real. The family photographs were real. The religious shrine near the door, and the stack of books, and the Tagalog Bible were all real. What was not real was the version of Marisel that Gary believed himself to be married to. In the apartment 2 floors below hers, in a unit rented under a different name, 3 other women ran variations of the same operation. They were not an organized crime syndicate in any dramatic sense. No hierarchy, no enforcement mechanism, nothing that would survive the description in a thriller novel. They were a loosely connected group of women in their 20s and early 30s who had figured out, through a combination of necessity and observation, that there was money to be extracted from lonely Western men who wanted to believe they had found love online. They shared strategies. They compared notes. They helped each other when a mark required more than one person to manage. Marisel was good at this. Not ruthlessly good, she was not a woman without conscience. And there were moments, in the long video calls with Gary, when something he said would catch her off guard with its sincerity, and she would feel a flicker of discomfort that she had learned to quickly suppress. She had grown up with very little in Leyte. She had watched her mother work herself into exhaustion for wages that didn't cover the basics. She told herself that what she was doing was survival, and survival required a kind of compartmentalization she had become expert at. Her real partner was a man named Ronnie, a few years older than her, easygoing, aware of and complicit in the scheme, in the particular way of someone who benefits from something without wanting to examine it too closely. He called her on a separate phone. He visited when the schedule allowed. He thought of Gary as an abstraction, the American, he called him, with a half smile that Marisel found, depending on her mood, either reassuring or slightly corrosive. Gary knew nothing of Ronnie. Gary knew the Marisel who called him Mahal and remembered the name of his dead dog, and cried at their civil ceremony in a cream-colored dress. That Marisel was the product of months of careful construction. And she was, in the ways that mattered for the operation, entirely convincing. By December, 2 months after the wedding, the financial requests had begun to escalate with a new urgency. It started with a message about the house. Marisel explained it carefully over a video call, with the measured tone of someone who had thought about how to bring something up and was trying to do it with the least possible disruption. She had been thinking, she said, about their future, specifically about where they would live when she eventually joined him in Tulsa, but also about having somewhere stable in the Philippines they could return to, a place that felt like theirs. She had found a property, a modest house in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Cebu City, nothing elaborate, but solid, and in a location her family could help look after if they were away. The deposit required to secure it was $12,000. Gary's first instinct was to ask to see documents. Marisel produced them within 24 hours, photographs of the property, a typed agreement letter with an official-looking header from what appeared to be a real estate brokerage, a floor plan, and a summary of the terms. Gary looked at these materials with the eyes of a man who wanted to believe they were legitimate, and succeeded in convincing himself that they were. He transferred $12,000. The property, of course, did not exist in any form that would ever benefit Gary Hutchins. The documents had been assembled from templates and fragments of real estate paperwork that the women in the building used and reused, adjusted for each mark's apparent level of scrutiny. Gary put the wire transfer receipt in a folder labeled Philippines House Documents and kept it in his filing cabinet next to his pension statements. January brought a new category of crisis. Marisel's mother, whose heart condition Gary had helped address 8 months earlier with the initial $1,800, had deteriorated, she said. A specialist in Cebu City had recommended a procedure that the provincial health system could not cover. The cost was $4,200. Marisel told him this on a Tuesday morning call, and Gary could hear, behind her voice, the quality of controlled distress that he had come to associate with her at her most genuine. The careful breath before a difficult sentence. The pause that felt like someone steadying themselves against something. He sent the money the same day. In February, her younger sister, who Gary had heard about but never seen on a video call, was apparently facing a crisis at school. The school in Leyte where she was enrolled required a lump sum payment for examination fees and course materials that the family couldn't cover. $2,200. Gary sent it. In March, there was a problem with Marisel's work situation. Her company, she explained, was restructuring. Her position was not at risk, but there were changes coming that would affect the bonus structure she had been relying on to supplement her salary. She was worried about maintaining the monthly contributions she'd been making to the house deposit fund. Gary's $12,000, she explained, had only covered the initial payment. There were ongoing installments required to hold the property. She needed $3,100 to keep current. Gary sent it. He was, by the end of March, approximately $33,000 removed from the savings account he had retired on. He had not told Dennis or Ray the specifics. He mentioned the house purchase vaguely, described it as an investment in their shared future, which in his mind it still was. He had not calculated the total. He had been careful not to, in the way that people are careful not to step on a scale when they already know the number will be uncomfortable. He missed her. That was the unadorned truth of his days in Tulsa. The house was quiet, in the particular way that houses are quiet when there is no expectation of anyone arriving to fill them. He would wake at the time that corresponded to her evening in the Philippines, which had become his internal clock whether he intended it or not, and he would make coffee and open his laptop and wait for her face to appear, and when it did, something inside him settled in a way that nothing else in his daily life managed to produce. He told himself this feeling was the proof of something real. What it was the proof of was the sophistication of what had been done to him. The business trips to Manila began in the spring. Marisel mentioned the first one, almost as an afterthought, in April. Her company was sending a small delegation to a trade conference at the World Trade Center, Manila, she said, and she had been selected as part of the team, which was both exciting and exhausting. She would be gone for 5 days. She would have limited time to call. She was sorry in advance. Gary told her not to apologize. He told her he was proud of her. She returned from the first trip with photographs, the conference registration desk, a group dinner at what appeared to be a hotel restaurant, the view from a high floor of the Manila skyline at night. The photos felt real. The details she provided when he asked about the conference, the names of brands represented, the general topics covered were plausible in the vague way of things that cannot easily be disproven. The second business trip happened in June. Then, a third in August. Each time the calls were sparser during those weeks she was busy, she said, in meetings, exhausted by evenings. Each time she returned with photographs and stories. Each time Gary accepted this without serious scrutiny, because scrutiny required a willingness to consider possibilities that he was not yet willing to consider. What the trips actually were was time. Time in Manila, with Ronnie, who would fly up from Cebu when the schedule allowed. Time in a hotel room that Gary was, through the most recent business trip advance of $3,100, one of several advance expense transfers Marisel had requested over the preceding months to cover conference registration and accommodation before the company reimbursement came through unknowingly funding. Ronnie would sometimes look at the hotel room and make a joke that Marisel didn't always find funny. She would tell him to be quiet, and he would laugh and change the subject. By October, Gary had been sending a monthly allowance for 14 months, had funded a house deposit that did not exist, had covered multiple medical and educational crises, and had transferred business trip advances that totaled $3,100. His total loss, not including his flights and personal travel costs, was approaching $35,000. He was not happy. Exactly, the distance was wearing on him in ways he didn't always admit, but he was not yet suspicious. He was impatient. He was tired of waiting. He was a man who had found what he believed was the last good thing, and was growing restless at the bureaucratic delay standing between him and it. In November, he made a decision. He would go to Manila. He would surprise her. He would book a flight, not tell her he was coming, and show up at the hotel she had mentioned, the Seda Hotel in BGC, where she said the company always booked accommodations during Manila conferences. He had the hotel name. He could figure out the room. He thought about it for 3 days. It seemed romantic to him. The spontaneity of it, the gesture, the proof that he was still capable of doing something unexpected and alive. He hadn't told a soul. He bought sampaguita flowers from a vendor because he'd read they were the national flower of the Philippines, and he thought she would find it touching. He checked in at a hotel 2 blocks away from the Seda, dropped his bag, and walked over in the early afternoon. The lobby of the Seda Hotel in BGC was cool and clean, the air conditioning producing a climate that felt entirely disconnected from the heat outside. Gary approached the front desk and explained to the young woman there that he was looking for his wife. He used that word with a quiet, private pride who was staying at the hotel for a business conference. He gave the name Marisel Aguilar Hutchins, using both her maiden and married names, and presented his own passport. The desk clerk checked the system. She found the reservation. She looked at Gary's passport and then back at her screen. She gave him the room number. Gary took the elevator to the correct floor and walked down the corridor with the sampaguita flowers in one hand and the wine bottle under his arm, his reflection ghosting alongside him in the polished surface of the hallway wall. He was aware of a low-frequency excitement in his chest, the anticipation of the surprise, the imagined look on her face. He had been rehearsing this moment for the entire flight. He found the room. He stopped in front of the door. He raised his hand to knock, and then he heard a man laugh. It was a relaxed laugh, the laugh of someone entirely comfortable in the space they were in, entirely at ease, not the laugh of a colleague or a conference contact or someone who happened to be standing in a hallway outside a room. It came from inside, from within. Then he heard Marisel's laugh. He knew her laugh. He had heard it hundreds of times through a phone screen. He knew its particular quality, the way it started, low and built, the small sound she made when something genuinely surprised her into amusement. This was that laugh. Gary Hutchins stood in the corridor of the Seda Hotel in BGC, Manila, his hand still raised, and did not knock. Later he would count 11 seconds. He stood there for 11 seconds before he lowered his hand and took a step back. He pressed himself against the wall beside the doorframe and with shaking hands took his phone from his pocket and opened the voice recorder and pressed the red button. He held the phone as close to the door as he dared. He recorded for approximately 3 minutes. He heard voices, Marisel's and a man's, the conversation in Tagalog that he couldn't follow, punctuated by the ordinary sounds of people comfortable in a shared space. The television. A chair moving. Another laugh. Different this time, closer, softer, intimate in the way that sounds are intimate when they are not meant to be heard. He walked to the end of the corridor. He stood at the window that looked out over the streets of BGC, over the glass towers and the organized grid of a district that had been built, quite literally, on land reclaimed from something else. He held the sampaguita flowers. He stood there for a long time. He did not call her. He did not knock on the door. He did not go to the front desk and ask them to call the room. He walked back through the lobby, past the cool air and the clean surfaces and the desk clerk who had given him the room number, and out through the glass doors into the November heat of Manila. And he kept walking until he found a bench near a small park where he sat down and held the flowers in his lap and stared at the ground between his feet. The flowers were already wilting in the heat. He spent 2 nights at the hotel 2 blocks away, which was 2 nights more than he needed to confirm what he already knew, but fewer than he needed to figure out what to do about it. He did not call her. He let her calls go to voicemail, 4 of them over those 2 days. Cheerful messages, wondering how he was, telling him about her day at the conference, asking if he had eaten. Each one was a small, precise act of cruelty that he was relatively certain she did not think of as cruelty. He sat in his hotel room and listened to them, and then put the phone face down on the bed. On the second night, he uploaded the audio recording to his laptop and spent an hour listening to it through headphones, willing himself to hear something that would create an alternative interpretation. There was none. The quality of presence in that room, The relaxed laughter, the ease, the silence between words that only exists between people who have run out of the need to fill it was not the presence of colleagues at a conference. He knew what he had heard. He called his daughter in Colorado from the hotel room at midnight Manila time. She answered on the third ring, alarmed by the late hour, and he told her only that he was in the Philippines and things hadn't gone the way he expected, and he needed to hear a familiar voice. She didn't press him for details. She talked to him for 40 minutes about her own life, her kids, her husband, the problem with their kitchen renovation. And Gary sat in the dark hotel room and listened and felt grateful for the entirely ordinary quality of everything she was saying. The next morning, he sent Marisel a message saying he had been dealing with some health issues and hadn't felt like talking. He told her he loved her. The lie came easily, which frightened him slightly. He flew home to Tulsa on a Thursday, a week earlier than originally planned. He told the airline he had a family situation. He sat in the middle seat for the long leg from Seoul to Los Angeles and looked at the audio file icon on his phone's screen and thought about the 11 seconds in the corridor and what they had cost him. He hired a lawyer that same week, a woman who specialized in international family law, and explained his situation. The news she delivered was complicated in ways he hadn't anticipated. Philippine law does not recognize divorce for Filipino citizens, meaning the civil ceremony he had participated in Cebu was governed by a legal framework almost entirely different from what he understood. An annulment, she explained, was possible, but slow and expensive and not guaranteed. Furthermore, she had questions about the documentation Marisel had provided for the ceremony irregularities, she said. That might actually mean the marriage had no legal standing whatsoever, which was bad news in the sense of emotional betrayal, but potentially favorable news in the narrower, more pragmatic sense of legal complication. Gary sat across from the lawyer and nodded at everything she said and felt. Underneath the information she was delivering, the particular exhaustion of someone who has been carrying a weight they chose not to examine for too long. He went home and sat at his kitchen table and looked at the frame on the shelf, the photo of Marisel at the market with the vegetables, and the caption about their future, and he took it down. The accounting, when he finally sat down to do it, was less brutal than it might have been, and more brutal than he had allowed himself to know. $1,800 for the first medical emergency, $8,400 in monthly allowances over 14 months, $4,200 in wedding and ceremony costs, $4,200 for the second medical crisis in January, $2,200 for his sister-in-law's school fees, $12,000 for the house deposit that had never existed, $3,100 in business trip advances. He went through his bank records for the better part of a Saturday morning, writing the numbers in a column on a legal pad. The flights and accommodation he had paid for himself he added separately. The total, when he circled it at the bottom of the page, was approximately $39,900. He looked at the number for a while. Then he folded the legal pad and put it in the filing cabinet next to the folder labeled Philippines House Documents. He reported the situation to his bank and to the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center, as his lawyer recommended. He filled out the forms with the thoroughness of an engineer who understood that documentation mattered. He provided the audio recording, the wire transfer records, the photographs, the fake property documents. He was told what he expected to be told: that recovery of funds in cases like this was unlikely, that the investigation could take years, that the best he could do was provide information that might help protect someone else down the line. He contacted a priest at his church whom he had known for 20 years, not for confession exactly, but for the kind of conversation that required someone who could hold weight without being crushed by it. The priest listened for a long time and then said something Gary found unexpectedly useful. "You didn't lose this money because you were foolish. You lost it because you were hungry for something real, and someone handed you a very convincing imitation of it. Those aren't the same thing." Gary thought about that for a long time. He found an online support group for men who had been defrauded in romance scams in the Philippines and Southeast Asia. He joined under a username that masked his identity and read through the forum threads for several weeks before he posted anything himself. What he found there was not comfort exactly, but recognition men from a dozen countries, of varying ages and circumstances, who had experienced variations of the same progression, the initial warmth, the credible backstory, the patience before the first ask, the manufactured crises, the real trip that confirmed everything felt real, the slow escalation, the loss. Some of them had lost far more than Gary. Some were still in the middle of it, not yet ready to see what they were in the middle of. He found himself writing long responses to those men, careful, specific, without judgment, the way someone writes when they are trying to say the thing that no one said to them in time. This was, he would come to understand, the only useful thing that emerged from the entire experience. Not wisdom exactly, he wasn't sure the word applied, but the capacity to recognize something from the inside that looked entirely different from the outside, and to explain that gap to someone who was standing in it. He never attempted to contact Marisel again. The number she had used went to a message saying it was no longer in service within 2 weeks of his return to Tulsa. Her Filipino Cupid profile had been removed. Her Facebook account, which Gary had always been able to find, was gone. The email address she had used for their correspondence bounced. She had been, in the most literal sense possible, designed to disappear, and she had disappeared with the efficiency of someone who had done it before and would do it again. Gerald Hutchins is 63 years old now. He still lives in the house in Tulsa. He still takes his coffee black at the kitchen table in the morning. Though the specific ritual that morning used to contain the laptop open, the wait for a face to appear has been replaced by a newspaper, physical, ink on paper. The kind that requires no internet connection. His savings are diminished but not destroyed. He has enough to live on if he is careful, which he is more careful now than he has ever been, in the various ways that the word applies. He does not use dating apps. He is not opposed to the idea of meeting someone, in the abstract, his therapist has told him, with the measured optimism of a professional who chooses to believe in people's capacity to recover, that he is not permanently closed to it, and Gary does not entirely disagree. But he is in no rush, and he has made his peace with that. He remains active in the online support group. He has spoken, over the past 2 years, with hundreds of men in the early stages of what happened to him. Men who are suspicious, but not yet certain. Men who have already sent money and are looking for permission to keep sending it. Men who have lost everything and are looking for evidence that it is possible to exist on the other side. Gary speaks to all of them with the same plain directness he used to bring to engineering problems. Here is what I know. Here is what I missed. Here is what it cost. Here is how I am still standing. He never remarried. He is not sure he will. He has thought, in quieter moments, about whether the marriage to Marisel was legally real in any technical sense. His lawyer's assessment that the documentation irregularities may have voided the ceremony is something he has chosen, for his own sanity, to lean on. In the more honest corners of himself, he knows it doesn't much matter. A piece of paper can be valid or invalid. What happened to him happened either way. The last entry on his legal pad, the one with the column of numbers from that Saturday morning, is not a dollar amount. It is a sentence he wrote after he circled the total and sat with it for a while. He wrote, "A man who wants to be loved is not a fool. He is just a man." He folded the pad and put it away, but he remembered what it said. The woman who called him Mahal is almost certainly doing, at this moment, some version of what she did to Gary, using a different name, a different photograph, a different backstory assembled from the same components. The 11 seconds in a Manila hotel corridor that ended one man's illusion were, for her, simply the close of a transaction. The next one began, in all probability, before Gary had reached the elevator. Somewhere tonight, in Tulsa or Melbourne or Stuttgart or Manchester, there's a man sitting alone at a kitchen table with a laptop open and a coffee going cold, waiting for a face to appear on his screen and make the rest of the day feel worth the effort. He believes he has found something extraordinary. He believes he has been chosen. He has not been chosen. He has been identified. If you are that man, if any part of this story sounds like the story you are currently living, please listen carefully to what Gerald Hutchins, 63 years old, retired pipeline engineer from Tulsa, Oklahoma, wants you to hear. The love that costs you everything before you have even met in person is not love. Love does not arrive through a series of financial emergencies. Love does not disappear when the money runs out. Love does not leave an empty hotel corridor and a disconnected phone number and a legal pad with a number circled at the bottom. What Gary found in that corridor was not the end of his life. It was the end of a story someone else had written for him. Learning to tell his own story again, that took longer and cost more than any wire transfer and had no dollar figure he could put in a column. But he is doing it. Slowly, plainly, in the only way he knows how. If this story reached you at the right moment, share it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you want more investigations like this one, subscribe. There are more stories waiting to be told, and every one of them matters.